Hi everyone, and welcome back to our lecture series. Today we're going to be talking about the exile and the post-exilic period and what that really meant for Israel. This week's lecture is going to be a little bit more oriented around history than some of the others have been, but we're still going to be looking at the biblical literature and seeing in particular how particular books or particular parts of books even fit into that history. We're really going to be looking at three very distinct periods: the exile itself, the early stages of the return, so the early post-exilic period, and then a little bit later on into the post-exilic period, some of the later stages of the return. And with each stage, we're going to be looking at some of the problems that come up, some of the solutions to those problems, and how those solutions fit into the larger picture of the development of the religion. We'll start really with the exile itself. So when we're talking about the exile, we are talking about the period that, as you now know, begins in 586 with the fall of Jerusalem and when Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem, and ends with Cyrus's proclamation that the Jews who are living in Babylon may return to their homes and to their homeland. Now, it would not be unfair to say that this is really one of the most important events, perhaps even the most important event for ancient Israel and its religious life, because the fall of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon really forces a re-examination of the relationship between Israel and its God. Two major points in particular really demonstrate this. The first is the loss of the land. Now, this is really, really important because generally in the view of ancient Near Eastern cultures, when a people is defeated, that is, when a land is conquered and the people that live there are defeated in battle, the view generally is that that people's God has also been defeated by the conquering army and the deity that is behind that army. So there's a very real question in the exile about the extent to which it is proper or even really possible to worship the same God in Babylon that those exiles worshipped when they were in Judah. And if they are going to continue to do so, and again, the question of if is a very real question, but if they're going to continue to do so, they also have to, they are there with the realization, that is, that the structures of their religion, the temple, the priesthood, all of these things that really kind of made the religion work in the period of the monarchy, that these are gone, that they have collapsed. So there's a major religious component of the exile in an attempt to negotiate how the worship of the same God that they worshipped in Judah could continue while in exile in Babylon and even beyond. The second major thing that we really need to note is the loss of the monarchy and the end of the line of David. So even following the collapse of the northern kingdom, the fall of its monarchy, when it was conquered in 722, the southern kingdom, Judah, remained confident that the Davidic line would continue into perpetuity. We can see this confidence at work in Psalm 132 or in the vision in Isaiah 9, for example. But following the destruction of Jerusalem and the removal of Zedekiah as its king, no one in the line of David occupied that throne anymore because there was no throne to occupy. So this as well is a major crisis in the faith, because a central tenet, the inviolability of the line of David and of Zion, is really called into question. We can see some of these tensions really at work in the book of Ezekiel, a book that really is grappling with the crisis of exile. First, there's the idea that the destruction of the temple has led to a disconnect between God and Israel, and this idea is really worked out in particular in Ezekiel's vision of God's departure from the temple, especially in chapters 10 and 11. So in Ezekiel's view, what's happening here is that God's glory is leaving the temple prior to its destruction, right? That what's happening is that Jerusalem's destruction is not so much a defeat of God, but the destruction is in fact due to God's abandoning Jerusalem, as the temple is no longer a place suitable for God's glory. Second, though, we also need to note about Ezekiel that while the judgment oracles in Ezekiel are really very harsh and are among the harshest in the entire Bible, Ezekiel is also a book of really profound hope, particularly towards the end. Coming to mind here are things like Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of the Dry Bones in chapter 37, which really paints a very vivid picture of a people being brought back from the point of annihilation. Equally hopeful is the vision of the new temple that's assembled this time to prevent the kind of profanation that endangered the one that God left in the beginning of the book. Now, we need to note here that the vision that Ezekiel has of a temple is not of the temple that was actually rebuilt in 516. So it's not a historical vision. Rather, what it is a literary and a theological construction that demonstrates the theological point that God will undertake the action necessary to bring about the restoration, and that once again, God will dwell in that temple, that temple will be a suitable place for God to return. So we're really talking about a theological vision there, not a historical vision. As we move on, as we move from the exile proper, we come to the end of the exile. And so if this period of the exile and the fall of Jerusalem represents a period of nearly unimaginable grief for Israel, it's also matched in some ways by the unbounded joy and the hope of the end of that exile. So against the odds of history, right, the exiled community has somehow managed to maintain its identity in Babylon. And they do this through by maintaining an understanding that of an identity by it's an identity that goes through modification so that it can somehow survive. There's modification and there's innovation that really binds the community together. And then we see at this particular moment, at the moment of the end of the exile, this joy and optimism in the conquering of Cyrus, or when Cyrus conquers Babylon and proclaims that the exiled Judean community may go home. And 2nd Isaiah provides really the clearest reflection of this theme. Now, I want to step back for a second, because if you go looking for a book called 2nd Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible, you're not going to find it. Let me explain what's going on here. So despite the fact that Isaiah is presented as a single book in its current form, that is how we find it currently in the Bible, most scholars agree that it should be distinguished as really coming from 3 distinct periods. First is the one that we've already discussed, that roughly corresponds with chapters 1 to 39, that concerns itself with the events of the late 8th century. Chapter 40, however, marks a real and a very strong turning point in the book, where both in terms of the style with which the material is presented and in terms of the events that are being discussed, there's something new that's going on. And so from this section from chapter 40 through chapter 55 is oftentimes referred to as Deutero or 2nd Isaiah. And then there's a third section that is found in chapters 55 to 66 that is oftentimes referred to as Trito or 3rd Isaiah. Now, if you think back to our discussion about the prophets of the monarchy, I hope, at least, that you remember that I placed particular emphasis on the primary point of prophecy not being about telling a detailed plan of the future, but rather about communicating the mind of God in the present. Now, if we keep this principle in mind, we can really see why 2nd Isaiah is dated to the end of the 6th century rather than back as a prophecy that looks forward 200, 300 years into the future. All of the events discussed in this section, in the section of chapter 40 through 55, are contemporary to the period of the end of the exile and the rise of Cyrus. He's named numerous times in this. In chapters 44 and 45, we see Cyrus showing up, even so much as to be called the anointed of God there. And the verb tense as well here is a past tense, a tense that in Hebrew, a perfect tense that is used to signify completed action. That is, the prophetic oracles here are not looking forward to Cyrus coming at some point in the distant future, but are instead explaining his rise in the present. Theologically, then, we should note also that this section of Isaiah is not one of judgment and punishment, as kind of dominates the first section of Isaiah, but is really more of reconciliation and hope. And we certainly see those themes in the sections of First Isaiah as well. It's not that First Isaiah is all judgment and punishment. There certainly are very strong notes of hope there, and that's exactly why this is probably coming from the Isaianic tradition. The prophet that we are calling now Second Isaiah picks up on themes that Isaiah of Jerusalem, the 8th century prophet, also carried, and is moving within that tradition. Another really important development, or one that we really can't understate, is that it's in this period that we really see a move towards something that we can really truly call monotheism in the religion of the Israelites. Now, this requires a little bit of an explanation, because Israel, of course, had always been committed and in a what we might call exclusive relationship to its God, at least in its ideal form. That is to say, when Israel is not in this, it causes problems. But within that exclusive relationship, there's a kind of tacit acknowledgement that other gods may in fact exist. It was just that Israel was not to follow those gods. So if we look even to the first of the 10 Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. If we kind of put the emphasis on the preposition there, before, we can see this at work. So too, in Psalm 82, there are other gods present there, although ultimately in the psalm those gods are kind of sentenced to die as mortals do. Properly speaking, then, if we are to give a label to this type of religious outlook, an outlook where a group acknowledges the existence of multiple gods, but really only worships one God, we call this henotheism, and that's what most scholars would say, that up until this point the religion of ancient Israel really was, that it was a henotheistic religion. But it's around this time of 2nd Isaiah that we see a shift among the exilic and early post-exilic community from henotheism to a true monotheism, a religion that only acknowledges the existence of one God. Now, we can see this in 2nd Isaiah most strongly in the prophet's polemic against idols, particularly in chapters 44 and 46. Here we see something of the innovation of this period that's kind of caused by the burning questions of the exile. When the exiles ask themselves if their God is still God in Babylon, the answer that they ultimately find is yes. And not just in Judah, but in Babylon and everywhere else. Furthermore, it is this God who has the power to stir up great armies and defeat the seemingly mighty forces of Babylon, all for the sake of God's people. The same God that sent the Judeans into exile now calls them home with the promise of future glory. And it is this same God who is in charge of creating the world, who has been with the world from beginning to end. So we see that kind of radical shift towards Israel really not just having one God, but acknowledging the existence of only one God. And we see them moving towards this very kind of hopeful future in 2nd Isaiah, right? That as they are going back to the land, there's this unbridled optimism and sense of hope. Unfortunately, it turns out that the return and the future that they anticipated would be, that it turned out to be a little bit messier. First, even with the decree of Cyrus that the exiles are allowed to go home, not everybody goes. The return happens in several waves, but even with all of those waves, there are a substantial number that remain in Babylon and continue to build a life and a community there. Second, for those that did return, and somewhat in contrast to the hope of Second Isaiah, what they find when they get back to this now Persian province Yehud is a more complicated life than they had initially anticipated. Some of the conflict stemmed from the simple fact that those who had been carried off into exile constituted only a part, and a particularly elite part of the community. Nevertheless, the community returning from exile must have regarded itself as the true kind of core community. And this belief brought them into a somewhat understandable conflict with those who had stayed behind. Likewise, the boundaries of the community, who's in and who's out, these are also the subject of intense negotiation during this period. Questions like whether foreigners can be included in the religious life of the community, a question behind Isaiah 56. The marriage of Jews and foreigners, conflicts over the reconstruction of the temple, and a little bit later on, the conflict over the reconstruction of the wall around Jerusalem. All of these issues can kind of continually threaten to divide the community. The texts of 3rd Isaiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, Nehemiah, all of these explore these issues, and within each they're trying to find a way to negotiate what it means to have this community reconstituted. It's also possible, though this is a bit less certain, but it's also entirely possible that Ruth and Jonah are really speaking to these times. Now, each of those books are set in an older period. For example, Ruth in the period of the Judges, and Jonah kind of in presumably the classical period of prophecy. But each of them seems really to speak to some of the issues that are really at the fore in this post-exilic time period, challenging in either case the more exclusive view of the community that seems to have been offered by Ezra. So these are some of the questions that are really going on, and some of the issues that are really at the fore in the Second Temple period. The other truly landmark development that takes place during this period is a move towards a kind of canonized written literature within the religion. So Israelite religion during the monarchy certainly had a place for written literature and for revered literature. And we can see this in particular in the reforms of Josiah, where a scroll is discovered and then read before the community, and then there's mourning, and then they make a very strong effort to live out what is written in that scroll. In Nehemiah 8, though, we see something kind of similar, but it works a little bit differently. So in Nehemiah 8, the scribe Ezra reads to the assembled people what he described, or what is described in that book as the scroll of the law of Moses. So now this is not the first time that this term occurs in the Bible. We do see it in Joshua and 2 Kings, but this is the first time that this term is really being used for something that is proclaimed and read publicly, and then is acknowledged as something that's going to be followed. So as such, scholars see in this period turn towards Torah obedience as something that's very, very important. This is being put at the very center of religious observance. And perhaps most importantly, what it really does is it solidifies the Torah as a canonical work, that is, as an accepted and authoritative scripture. So it's really in this period that we kind of see the beginnings of a religion of the book. Now, if we take all of these developments together, especially the move towards monotheism and the development and the central place of this of a canonical scripture of the Torah, and then finally the reconstruction and the central locus of the rebuilt Jerusalem temple, we can see the primary features all at work in the period that the scholars refer to as Second Temple Judaism. Now, an astute observer will notice that up until this point in the course, I have refrained from using terms like Judaism to describe the religious traditions of ancient Israel. The reason I've done this is because most scholars look to this period and say that this is the time that we can really speak of the beginnings of Judaism, properly speaking. Now, to be absolutely clear, I'm not suggesting that there's some sort of radical disconnect between the ancient Israelite traditions of the monarchy and even before, and the traditions that we now find in the Second Temple period. This has been thrown around by folks with anti-Semitic agendas that really want to see these periods as entirely distinct and separate. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting much more of a continuity, but what I'm suggesting is that the innovations that take place in this period lead us to the point where the terminology of Second Temple Judaism really becomes much more appropriate. If you're interested in this topic, and in particular how Second Temple Judaism continues to develop and ultimately becomes the wellspring for later Rabbinic Judaism and even Christianity, I would commend to your reading this really wonderful book called Rebecca's Children by Alan Siegel. It's not very long. It's very, very accessible. It is just a wonderful piece of scholarship that describes this period that we're kind of now talking to, and as it moves into the Roman period and beyond. I'll put a link to that book up on our course discussion page. It's one that really is worth having in your personal library. That's all for this week. Next week, we will move on to the topic of wisdom literature. Please remember also that next week, when we get together for, not this coming Saturday, but the following Saturday, when we get together for our exegesis sessions, that I also need to be getting the texts from you that you would like to use for your final project. This is so that I can give you a little bit of feedback on it and perhaps recommend resources to you and help you to figure out where you want to go with that project. If you have any questions in the meantime, of course, please email or call me, and I will see you next week.